Thanks very much for coming in. Welcome to Critique of the New, and a day-long event that's been organized by our PhD students here at the AA. And I think the first point to say is, of course, it's an absolute pleasure and delight to be able to kick off such an event, what I hope will become an annual springtime event here at the school that brings together the work that's going on within the PhD program with other scholars, critics, historians, and theorists, and very much expand the pedagogical ambition of a school that I think for many years has been thought of in terms of units and programs that explore, investigate, interrogate architecture through the projection or through the pursuit of projects, which I think many of us know today is interesting in no small way for the way in which that kind of activity can intersect with other forms of inquiry, investigation, and what you all know is one of my pet projects, the production of words in a world in which images seem to be killing us over and over again. And I think it's just a great pleasure that to be able to kick this event off this morning and to welcome all of you and what I know is a brilliant group of people who will be presenting research and writing at various stages of its development in relation to some of the PhD projects going on right now, but also the work and thinking of critics who've been invited in to participate in the discussion. During the past couple of years, the AA has tried to pursue an expanded pedagogical field in many different ways. You all know that in our launch of things like the research clusters, the AACP, the critical projects, curatorial practices group, and this is another extension, I think, of those kind of ambitions, and one that can be driven by forms of writing and criticism that are already taking place here in the school that I think too often haven't been given the kind of space and sometimes shape, sometimes form needed for those kind of activities to be pursued. The primary ambition here is to really set up a channel within the PhD program itself for a more public discussion and debate across lines, sometimes party lines, sometimes other kinds of lines, that can really open up some of the brilliant work that's been taking place for many years within the program, but too often contained in bound volumes, hidden away on shelves upstairs. And I think this is just a great kind of event for that sort of activity to take place. The theme that's been set for the day, you all know, the critique of the new, with two provocative words, touches on all kinds of cross-current discussions and debates. We live in a world that seems to be overwhelmed by new media every day. We live in political systems where terms like new labor come to canonize positions and ideas in ways that shorten or fragment discussion more than anything. New media, new labor. I was thinking new criticism itself is probably, there's something in the title of today's event that's a play on that, and what is probably one of the defining episodes in literary criticism over the last 40 or 50 years worldwide. Within architecture, I think we all know that one of the famous terrible translations that we all grew up reading is a book called Towards a New Architecture. It was an English interpretation of a book that was really just a collection of small essays written over a 3-year period by Le Corbusier, titled Towards an Architecture. Newness was thrown in almost without thinking, or so it's claimed, a few years later when the book was brought to this country, in fact several years later. And I think from that moment on, the status of newness, we all know, is one that's complex and sometimes misleading within a discipline that I think over and over again simply naturalizes the term as a definition of itself. I think one of the ambitions of the group of people that have put this great event together today is to go back and interrogate that anew in a situation where I think that word itself is already changing in new and unexpected ways. It's a great pleasure to welcome everybody who's here. Mark Wigley has come over from New York and will be participating in the discussion today and do a presentation at the end of the day. Diana Periton, Teresa Stepani, and Theo Spiropoulos are all here and will be, I believe, respondents in some form to the papers that have been presented and participate in the discussion. You're all welcome, of course, to join into the discussions as they take place at the end of each of the 3 sessions. And I thought I would turn it over to Jose Tovar, who will say something, I think, very briefly about how the day is organized. And in the meantime, thank you again for coming, and I'm looking forward to a fantastic day. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Brett. On behalf of the organizers of the symposium, I would like to say welcome, everybody. And well, today the structure of the event is going to be as follows. Today we are going to have 3 sessions. Each session presenting 3 papers, except for the last one. And each presentation will be 20 minutes long. So I will ask everybody, please, to try to consider those 20 minutes long, considering the timetable that we have for today. And then at the end of each session, we are going to have the discussion. So please keep the questions or any comments for this time, for the discussion. So let's start with the first session. And for the first session, we are going to have as contributors Tania Lopez, Pedro Alonso, and Juan Lee. And as the respondent, we're going to have Teresa Stopani. So please welcome Tania.
¿Tienes la computadora? Hi, everybody. Welcome. My paper is The Clue in the Rest of the New, and I'm trying to question the clue, the new in relation to time. The present paper draws from the PhD thesis, Clues in the Detection of London, Evidence of the Production of Knowledge of the City in 19th Century London, making use of the clue as a semantic device to assess the new in its intrinsic yet strange relation to time. By understanding the fleeting nature of the new and its arrest by the clue, we can put forward the argument that newness in architecture is found more in the reading of signs rather than in the mere application of technological developments, such as representational tools, scientific advances, materials, etc. That is to say, advances externals to the field. By no means is being implied that the implementation of such developments and field cross-fertilization are not important of the business of expanding architecture beyond the known, but to point out that it is not enough. A reading is required to secure the new in architecture. In this way, the clue enables an arrest of the fleeting nature of difference and proposes a new creative process that lies less in technology and more in the articulation of science. To this purpose, the argument draws upon fiction in the genre of private detective stories in the 19th century, considering the detective novel as a register of the city. The context, the crime scene, so to speak, of this register is a rapid growing city. A semiotic engagement is required in order to read the signs of differences and distances within the fabric of the growing metropolis. In this sense, the urban experience is put forward as a form of reading. For instance, in here, when you go in the city, you meet someone, and you can tell by the way he's dressing, by the way he looks, by the way he walks, if he's a person from the city that works in the city, and you can actually attach an address, even a route for transportation to it. In the city, the subject increasingly became trained in the practice of reading. Certain figures embody such apprenticeship: the handsome cab driver, the journalist, and, as described by Charles Baudelaire specific to Paris, the modern painter and the flaneur. In London, the private detective is the epitome of such practice. He is the personification of knowledge of the city in the city, having the clue as his semantic device and poetic kernel. From 19th century onwards, architecture and urban realities are read as in perpetual transformation, driven by a constant desire to supersede the past and reach novelty. The new, either as object or as event, offers a break from the past by promising the fantasy of a future already attained. Yet, everything, even the promise of a future, soon becomes past, as exemplified in the newspaper's front page time span. The crime that makes it to the front page in big headlines today, tomorrow will move consequent pages in smaller fonts. The new, usually understood as a thing not seen or experienced previously, is in fact subordinated to past. It departs from a fabric of established normality, past, just to soon be absorbed by it. For instance, the front page crime can only be so when it is ascribed within a constituted normality structured by law, as described in the work of Foucault, Discipline and Punish, and the Abnormal. The criminal wants to benefit from a future by bridging the law. The new requires a recognizable continuity in which to operate and mark a difference. Therefore, the new is always part of something other to itself, disciplinary, social, political, etc., substantiating its plural condition. In a sense, within this constituted fabric of normality, the new is subordinated to discontinuity and anachronism, attesting its fleeting nature. The new depends on the old and on difference. Since Gutenberg's print, the dissemination of news in England, developed from a book-like publication. This publication, which we can see that it was published in Amsterdam. It wasn't published in England. To reach a periodical status that marked continuity in time by using date on publication title page. That happened in this one, still not published in England. The first London Gazette was founded in 1666, and in March 11, 1702, the first daily paper, the Daily Courant, was founded. Needless to say, by 19th century London and Paris, street scenes are populated by newspaper stands. Continuity in time was established, but the continuity depends on facts that have already taken place. Today's news are yesterday's events. In the new, discontinuity in the fabric of normality. If the new is discontinuity in the fabric of normality, how much difference is required to attain full measure of the new? How can it be arrested? Just as the alleged front page crime, the attempt to reach the benefit of a perfect crime, or the new, to be noticed, it necessarily had taken place. The new is in fact past. It is its reading within an intelligible frame, the newspaper, which renders as new. When the private detective finds a clue, the culprit is arrested, and the new reaches the front page. In this way, the new is, as it were, arrested in time not as a promise, but as a warranty of a past future. The arrest of the new relies on the articulation of clues, proving that the new is more an articulated byproduct of the crime than the final goal of the creative process. In this way, the new is put forward as fleeting, not product, not just process, but a momentarily awareness that drives the whole effort of creating with fresh insight. With this framework, the new is pondered as fleeting moments outside the fabric of normality that can only be articulated and arrested in time through the practice of reading. So now let's see what is the clue. So how such awareness is pursued? First is the crime, and then the clue follows to enable the arrest. Understood as what is there that should not be there, and what is not there that should be there at any given moment, the clue unfolds different from the evidence, from a proficiency on the sign. So now let us imagine a private detective is called into solving a murder. As he is carefully inspecting the crime scene, his attention moves to the utility sink in the room. Something has got his attention, provoking in him an expression of shock combined with an underlying laugh. It is not the handgun or the blood spatter found in the sink, but the piece of paper next to the gun. He reads the note. This is not a clue. What does this imply? Is it a joke on the detective or on the whole semantic system? Well, the culprit has no sense of humor whatsoever. He is, in fact, pointing out the difference between evidence as something to be collected and the clue as a sign to be read. The simplest definition of sign is to mark, to protect, to consecrate. Semantic and structuralist theories provide useful insights in understanding the clue as a sign in a more precise sense. For now, we will focus on the so-so system of language account. Language becomes self-contained, and each and every one of the independent parts only function in their relationship to the whole. Signs are concrete entities, not mere abstractions. Facilitating the understanding of the clue as a concrete entity. When discussing the linguistic sign for the so-so, the word dog represents itself, but also the possibilities of dogs, according to the position of the sign within the system. As such, the concepts are defined negatively by their relations to other terms, not just by their content. Such concepts are like holes in a net, specified by their boundaries but empty in themselves. The clue is like this net hole, not pure content, but a possibility, not substance, but form. It is the absence that enables the presence, the ground supporting the figure. Form is understood as functional relations enabled by the clue. It is essential to understand that signs actually function, that they are not static but active, and most of all, that they function differently under different circumstances. It is the indication of something else that allows the private detective to experience the things of the world as signs, and that provides him with material and boundaries to solve the case. The figure of Sherlock Holmes experiences the thing of the world as signs, whereas Watson experiences the thing of the world as things. In this difference, the clue and sign are correlated. The shift that language and the sign endure in modernity becomes clearer. It is no longer required to reflect truly the world, but to operate fully in the concrete world. The sign becomes operative, and it is no longer a copy of the world, but a possibility of an operation. For example, maps as signs were developed charting particular aspects of the city. What began to constitute a more exact map in terms of scientific measurement, it is a calculated relation between absence-presence. The use of maps points out to the experience of the city as signs of the real space that we inhabit, closer to the detective experience of the things of this world. The main distinction between the police and the private detective emanates from the locus of investigation, from the way both characters operate within the crime scene. For the police, the crime scene is a source of evidence. For the detective, is the topological starting point of the clue. In the story of The Adventures of the Bruce Partington Plans by Conan Doyle, the figure of the detective is well exemplified by Sherlock Holmes, in opposition to that of the police. In this adventure, Mycroft Holmes comes to Sherlock. Mycroft is Sherlock's brother, by the way. Asking him to resolve the mystery that starts with a body. Asking him to resolve the mystery that starts with a body found on the underground tracks, making clear to his brother that national security is at stake in this mystery. The facts Sherlock and Watson had prior to Mycroft's visit came from the newspaper report. Lestrade, from Scotland Yard, accompanies Mycroft and gives the police advances on the case, that is to say, the collection of evidence. "We have had some fresh evidence this morning," said Lestrade, the police figure. It is at this point that the use of the clue by the detective differs from that of the use of the evidence by the police. The clue is concrete and arbitrary. It is a sign, whereas the nature of the evidence is that of collection. An inherent special distinction emerges from the use of information by the police and the detective, or between the evidence and the clue. The clue is instrumental in the reading of space and operates as a medium with no other aim than providing an insight in the solving of the case. On the other hand, the evidence needs to be collected, documented, and stored, following precise procedures according to law, in order to stand as valid evidence in court. Lestrade wants the evidence to stand as a direct explanation of the crime. Sherlock wants to put the clue in a chain of reasoning. The clue is not evidence. Nevertheless, at any moment, this differentiation shouldn't be taken as a neutralization of the evidence. The clue does not reject or neglect the evidence, but departs from it. While the evidence provides an obvious normative presence, the clue complements it in dealing with the not-so-obvious relational presences and absences. At the level of the evidence, the clue is a sort of negative semiological relation, since it represents a disruption in the fabric of normality, something that shouldn't be there or something that is not there and should be there. The clue that we are talking about is of a concrete and semantic nature. In this sense, the clue can be used not only in relation to objects, but also to topological conditions. Lestrade has collected evidence from the crime scene, the present facts, but it is Sherlock who uses the absences and presences in the alleged crime scene instrumentally. As Holmes and Watson leave the place where the body was found, the detective tells his comrade, it's one part, no, it's there, okay, sorry. So in here, the parts that I highlighted are the most important for the point of view of the argument. So we have the point where the train pitches, so it's the underground, is the knowledge of the space where the body was found, and the facts that they are focusing on things that are not there, actually, that they could not find. The private detective is presented with a case and with evidence and information of Mycroft, which is the government, and Lestrade's, which is the police. Finally, while the evidence is a problem of collection, the clue in operating with relational absences and presences deals with the problem of distance. It pertains to the category of distance, in that it brings together. And it is a problem of distance in a particular time frame. It represents a relationship between distance and time that is outside the category of speed. We can argue that the clue operates by instrumental use of relations between presence and absence, providing the required distance among collected facts, representing a disruption on the fabric of normality already constituted prior to the crime. It is this disruption, or slip of the tongue in psychoanalysis, which marks a difference. And it proves that difference is contained in relation to the existing, but it is articulated through a specific reading. A trained reading is required in the arrest of difference, of the new. From the reading of traces, the detective codifies the sign, and the sign becomes part of the fabric of data that will reassemble the knowledge of the event. Expanding the territory of the known with the reconfiguration of fragmented evidence is an effect of the codification, bringing an arrest in time of the disruption of difference. At the end, the crime, the pursuit of the new for the sake of the new by using technological development, so to speak. The crime per se is not what enables the arrest of the new, but the little and not so obvious gestures, traces left behind involuntarily by the culprit, that in the reading bring fresh light into the creative process. Two moments in the crime make the front page. The first awareness of the crime, and the arrest of the culprit by means of the clue. So the new, so who done it? Who is in charge of arresting the new? The criminal, slash the architect, or the detective slash the critic? Who reads and articulates the clues in the crime scene? Following Baudelaire's manifest on criticism in his Salon of 1846, we come to the conclusion that the criminal and the detective in the arrest of the new are embodied by the poet. And it reads, this quote reads like this: all great poets naturally and fatally become critics. I pity those poets who are guided by instinct alone. I regard them as incomplete. But in the spiritual life of the former, i.e. the great poets, a crisis inevitably occurs when they feel the need to reason about their art, to discover the obscure laws in virtue of which they have created, and to extract from this study a set of precepts whose divine aim is infallibility in poetic creation. It would be unthinkable for a critic to become a poet, and it is impossible for a poet not to contain within him a critic. Therefore, the reader will not be surprised at my regarding the poet as the best of all critics. Critical thought and creation, in Baudelaire's terms, are nothing but different aspects of the same process. If for a moment we parallel the poet as a criminal, being the poet, the architect, and the creative artist, it will be no surprise that Vidocq, the first ever private detective in history, began his career as a criminal. Thank you very much.
Hello. Good morning. Acronym. I have started drafting this paper many times, and each time I abandoned it, wondering whether there is any value in actually rehearsing the architectural use of acronym, or whether its use is a too banal subject matter has to be taken forward. Nevertheless, my interest in acronym is aroused not in spite of this apparent banality, but rather because of it. A certain fascination with such tiny words, which is more the fascination of the collector than that of the scholar, kept the matter before me. Amazed by the constant discovery of new acronyms, as if they were rare species populating the vast territory we used to call the contemporary. Carefully placed into an imaginary cabinet of curiosities, their many forms seems to demand some system of classification, for they are compounded from the abbreviation of names, the accumulation of initials, or the shortening of commercial brandings. And their diversity is extended by combining the lower and upper cases, the inclusion of numbers and signs, hyphens, dots, underscores, and the like, in an apparent attempt to name a renewed architectural practice. A naming method, usually reserved for institutions, organizations, and governmental agencies, seems particularly suitable for architecture, since the new words are not just created, but designed for their meaning, for the meaning they can be, is intimately related to their iconic appearance. The widespread use of acronym in contemporary architecture seems to call for the formulation of the following question. If acronym is the case, what else must be true in order to render it possible? And it must be true a connection between acronym and a persistent attempt to dismantle received structures of authorship. It must also be true that acronym relates to the long-standing accusations leveled at the architect to justify a more collaborative design process. in particular those proposed from the point of view of technology. Acronym then becomes, to the text I'm reading, a pretext to revise the collective whims of a technologically oriented sensibility, either linked to the industrialization of building or to the contemporary industrialization of design by means of software. This paper aims to recover the theoretical function of an attack on the architect, to wonder at the extent to which the modification in naming of architectural practices could be seen as a symptom, if not a consequence of this struggle. From an inquiry in the branding of architecture by the fabrication of non-existent words, and by providing critical commentary on the category of the new as a theoretical restriction to architecture, we aim to describe some connection between technology, discourse, and design. Certainly, acronym is nothing new in art or architecture, nor the connection between acronym and collaboration is new. Rafael Moneo, in referring to Ram Koolhaas, has explained that the acronym OMA is significant. According to Moneo, Koolhaas has always wanted to present his work as the fruit of a joint effort, as an alternative to the solitary activity of the artist-architect. Yet Koolhaas himself gives us an alternative reading of the more contemporary use of such words by explaining that acronym has come into being as a replacement of class struggle in a sonorous amalgamation of status. According to him, in suppressing letters or in the fabrication of non-existent plurals, the contemporary use of acronym aids to shed meaning in return for a new spacious roominess. Therefore, it seems that more than contracting a name, acronym seems to summarize a more complex debate and long-standing theoretical struggles. For more than a century, in architectural narratives, no single term has been more attacked and discredited than architecture itself, and by extension, the figure of the architect. Along with the death of the author, the architect's demise has been claimed and celebrated many times. If we were to trace back a history of the profession, we would find an alternative history, perhaps a more interesting one, in the long-standing blame directed at the architect and in the motivation behind such a critique. This attack has been relentless, and it has been rehearsed from within different discourses. A seminal strand of such debate is to be found in the discourses of the architecture of technology, as it references a modern movement in its look for renewal. In this, the architect, that romantically sketching hero, according to Gideon, pathetically unaware of the colossal impact of industrialization, according to Gropius, was challenged by the engineer, the modern man par excellence. The architect was not only held to be attached to the heaviness of stone and historical styles, he was also to be blamed as a romantic genius. His detachment from construction by his mastery of design did nothing but adding weight to this fateful journey. By the 1920s, the architect's individualistic pretension had failed to adjust to the anonymous and the collective, requirements claimed by the steel for reaching the universal. A model for this attack was, of course, a generalized praise for the Middle Ages and the Gothic cathedral, which, although well exemplified by German Expressionism, was not exclusive to it. Contrasting neoclassicism and the excesses of the Beaux-Arts, the medieval was seen as structural, rational, anonymous, and participative, all qualities praised by a modernist intent on the restructuring of society. New technologies and the impact of industrialization were linked to a social order that, like medieval times, was to be characterized as an anonymous and collaborative project. Walter Gropius, for instance, considered the master builder to be exemplary, playing a very prominent role within the whole production of his time. The architect was called on by Gropius to become the master builder of industrialization. Within a trajectory, exemplified by Gropius and Gideon, the ideal of anonymous collective work taken from this idealized conception of the Middle Ages is a recurrent theme in a utopian outlook and a romantic socialist agenda. By attacking the architect's individuality, praise for the medieval was fundamental in locating new technologies within an aspiration for architectural and social renewal. Yet the fact that master builders neither design Gothic cathedrals nor calculate their structure reveals the manner in which, against the individual architect, The higher authority of history has been used for over 100 years to support specific aspirations and their associated theoretical programs for design to be considered as a collective practice now with a technological orientation. Above and beyond a rejection of the horrors of the historical styles, modernist discourse went back to an idealized conception of the Middle Ages and by doing so transformed the Renaissance into its negative form. It is not hard to find Gideon proposing that all formulae are invalid today because a building is no longer a closed form like that of a Renaissance palace. The rhetoric of modernism required the affirmation of the new, a new architect, a new form, a new construction, and a new society, by the negation of previous forms, practices, and techniques like those of the Renaissance, whilst simultaneously claiming the right to be judged on the basis of its capacity to emerge from those forms as an opposition. This argument demands that in order for the new to be recognizable as new, it has to look as if it arises from an engagement with or is a type of negation of previous forms, like the Beaux-Arts or the Neoclassic. In short, it needs to clearly classify the old in order to articulate itself as an opposition to it. The new, in such a modernist discourse, rather than just being something never seen before, emerged to accomplish the brief imposed by a discipline like architecture, where advance is measured as a function of negation. In a similar way to that by which modernism found its negative in the Renaissance, contemporary architecture usually regards modernism itself as the old formula from which to emerge in opposition. Together with negating Renaissance, arguments in favor of an idealized concept of collaboration have always needed to incorporate another fundamental proposition by identifying the architect with the romantic genius and criticizing him consequently. Often, these two fundamental ideas combined are used to blame the architect who, by taking a distance from his supposed medieval roots, has become into an isolated individual. The persistence of these arguments is well exemplified by a continuous thread that links something like Gideon's concept of collective design of the 1920s, Walter Gropius's notion of teamwork of the 1930s and 40s, Konrad Baxmann's notion of the mechanics of collaboration in the 60s, and the more contemporary, digitally driven collective intelligence in designs of 2006. If not the same, they mark an interrupted critical discourse that goes back to the first decades of the last century and to the idea that without the collective, there will be, in Gideon's word, no architecture. As we mentioned before, the generalized reaction against the individual was clearly stated in the Steele's Manifesto of 1918 in terms of an opposition between the individual and the universal. Gideon and Gropius' writings exemplify the manner in which this somewhat Hegelian stance, since it was Hegel who indicated that the essence of art demands the diversity of the individual persons to be collected and combined into a universal unity, turned into a critique of the isolated architect, combining a valorization of the collective and anonymous with an idealization of the Middle Ages that certainly repeats itself in the contemporary. Nevertheless, while Gideon's socialist avowal of collective design envisaged thousands of workers directly transferring research into actions towards a classless society and the end of national borders, Gropius' teamwork and Baxmann's mechanics of collaboration went to the States and attempted to reconcile the collective with the economic structure of capitalism by means of an all-encompassing assemblage. Therefore, if there is any real continuity in the argument of architectural form as the logical consequence of collective work, it belongs to a certain law of transformation that holds the different inputs together, including the transposition of a core intellectual endeavor from one economic system to another, and linked to a certain undisclosed ideology of social transformation, which is layered onto or entangled in a theory that overtly claims a practical efficacy. This process of transformation has a contemporary currency. While the assumption that the medieval master builder was, in fact, an architect in all but name could be considered a reasonable characterization, based in the interplay of retrospective hypotheses, The usual identification of the architect as a romantic genius seems to be a case of syncretism. The architect's name, operating as branding, as a cultural capital, has accommodated the genius to the social and political structure of capitalism. It gives name to a company, locates its legal responsibility, and organizes the business. To deconstruct the status of the architect would implicitly act as a critique on the economic system in the same way that Gideon had promised the dawn of a classless society. Yet we know that the contemporary elimination of authorial choice and artistic authority contained in the creation of new linguistic signs, such as those derived from acronym, belongs rather, as Benjamin Butlow points out, to the attempt of reconnecting authorship to the actual condition of experience within advanced consumer culture, where the formation of exchange value residing in the sign solely determines the constitution of the identity of the consuming subject. Benjamin Butlow's description of the collage aesthetics in Rauschenberg's work that goes with the text cited in the previous quotation help us to remind of the importance of the technologies of assemblage for the modernist narratives concerned with collaboration. This would explain Gropius and Baxman's mystification of joints as the formal means for the achievement of diversity out of combination of standard parts. In fact, Gropius' favorite motto of unity in diversity extolled the joint assemblage and mechanical joints at the center of a discourse on technology and collaboration. If this is the case, it would be possible to suggest that joints and acronyms are unexpectedly equivalent objects, or the resulting visible signs of the same rhetoric. Not by chance, perhaps, they both operate contracting either construction of the name of architectural practices to irreducible minimal units of signification. Spanning over a century, techniques of dismantling authorial claims seem organized around the underlying regularities in collective design, teamwork, mechanics of collaboration, and collective intelligence in design, and suggests a common trajectory whereby new technologies, together with bringing new opportunities, sustain the promise of updating all desires and expectations. Such repeated aspirations reveal the way in which those expectations of progress, of social renewal, and so forth, determine the terms in which the new technologies are framed and conceptualized, becoming the repository of long-standing theoretical struggles. Moreover, those old expectations determine the path in which something like the digital is directed towards the achievement of collective design or the vanishing of individual authorship. It makes technology emerge in a rather weak position, always overwhelmed by fully formed expectations and unresolved paradoxes inherited from the pre-existing architectural or philosophical milieu. Along with high tech, there would exist something that we may call weak tech, and which is continuously forced to expand in directions imposed by restrictive theories, such as the stricture imposed by the category of the new as an overdetermined faction of negation. The point of contention here would be that a kind of technological determinism place architecture in the position of always receiving given techniques from a somewhat indeterminate elsewhere that lies outside of or independent from architecture. Such an insight into the ideological hinterland of architectural practice would allow us to refute the widely held belief that architecture's fate is nothing but to follow the fast company of technology, as Rainer Banham has expressed it. While, of course, the logic of technology never reaches the rhetoric of architecture, it is always deflected by it. Within the Western conception of action, logically and historically, architecture is held to the view that conception is followed by execution, or more pragmatically, design is followed by construction. Consequently, execution is seen chronologically subsequent, thereby logically inferior to conception or design. Historically, this view has privileged the singularity of the architect. Of course, the exponent could be some kind of collective subject, but the question becomes how this collective subjectivity would then think and conceive the work prior to execution within accounts of architectural practice that are themselves unstable. The commercialization of practice is necessarily based in the fiction that a design coming from the architect's office was indeed made by the individual architect from whom the office took its name. This fiction has been institutionalized over time, even if no one really believes it. It is a fiction lodged in the cultural capital vested in the name of the architect as commodity. That's why any attack on the architect seems to be spurious, for it is an attack on the fiction created by the commodification of practice, rather than a criticism of the actual and alternative forms that the practice of architecture has taken. Built on a different mode of representation, the discourse of reputation, the name as commodity gains higher value and conceals the actual division of labor within the office. A change to the name of the practice might seem like a way out of this ideological conundrum, but it would not necessarily affect the actual distribution of labor within the practice. In short, it is a criticism of the distribution of credits rather than on the distribution of labor. It is here that this attack on the individualism of the architect reveals in full extent of its role as a rhetorical device. The architect emerged yet again as a fiction character or a discursive component, ruthlessly disciplined in order to accommodate a very specific agenda. It is here too where newly constructed signs and languages, such as those created by acronym, previously residing and operating outside architecture, would now enter the architectural field, binding the desire for identity in different representational registers altogether. Beneath the subversive attempts of the centering the individual subjectivity of the architect by means of retrospective identifications, there is a permanent tension between the aspiration to dismantle hierarchies of authorship and the chance to achieve an expanded field for architectural practices. In fact, instead of planning the elimination of architecture through the substitution of construction, someone like Gideon wanted precisely the opposite, growing the discipline as to internalize new construction methods within a new and expanded meaning for architecture. Gideon's assumptions about the character and nature of the figure of the architect are only the rhetorical trope through which he is then able to advance what is in reality a defense of architecture directed at the updating of architectural discourse toward a cultural politics of permanent replacement grounded in the search for renewal. The idea that Gideon's argument is less an attack than a protective mechanism could also explain the role of acronym as a defensive strategy. When the practice is successful, the architect's name, far from disappear, is rather quoted by acronym in an extra layer of transcendence. One wonders to what extent long-standing tensions arising in the past start silently to shape the present and promise a future. While acronym serves as a way to recap the collective, all the while retaining the unique and the distinctive, what it does not do is to resolve the ideological problem concerning the division of labor in the commodification of practice. Then it lives, in a sense successfully, in a state of hiatus. Linguistically, acronyms become themselves powerful elements in elaborating our identity, an imaginary relationship towards the question of the proper name. By choosing the isolated architect as its negative form, acronym creates a space where a new, more indeterminate identity can be constructed. A change in the connection between words and buildings is being rehearsed. Names no longer connect a building to a person, but to the long-standing claims for collaboration. For those who will agree that the rhetorical is not to be blamed, one can be sure that this attack on the architect is pure rhetorical. Instead of naming something new, acronym would be part of an older intellectual project, the hope of renewal. Acronym could be then considered something to be what Vladimir Nabokov has called a transparent thing, through which the past shines. Thank you very much.
title of my presentation is The New in Translation. I am Hua Li from China, where I received 7 years architectural training and had 8 years architectural practice. When I was in China, Western architecture, its buildings, theories, ideas, and technologies was often referred to in academic discussions and daily practice. However, when I first came to the AA, I found extremely difficult to understand what people were talking about and why. The difficulties then became the topic of my PhD thesis, which concerns the conceptual translation of architectural discourse as the opposite to the linguistic translation and as a device to decode how systematic misreadings of importation took place in the Chinese context. This presentation will try to make this argument intelligible by looking into the category that the new indicated and operated in accounting for architectural imports from the West in the 20th century. The new in the West normally refers to the emergence of modernism. However, in Chinese architecture, this association is loose. The new, which is often associated with the Western, refers to all imports, whether they happen to be neoclassicism, modernism, postmodernism, or deconstructive architecture. To understand it, I will first use the hotel as an example to explore the category that the new indicated, and then we'll examine how it worked to account for the imported architecture schools. In Chinese context, the hotel signified the new by being identified as foreign, mainly regarded as synonymous with the Western and as a contrast to Chinese daily life and the traditional construction. This image is 1930s Shanghai. We can see the contrast between the Chinese residential area on the left and a new classical building on the right, which is a hotel, and whose name is New. As a number of other architecture types, the hotel was a new institutional space which began with importation in the late 19th century. It was first built up and served foreigners in China, mostly Europeans and Americans. Southern House, with its Cathay Hotel in Shanghai, was the acme in this signification. It was invested in by an Anglo-Jewish businessman, Victor Sasson, when it was built up on the international settlement in 1929. It was the tallest building in the city and was well known for its exotic guest rooms, dancing hall, nightclub, and restaurants. Its conspicuous appearance was Art Deco, a newly imported style of the time. From either the form of the building or the form of organization, the modern type of hotel has nothing to do with the traditional Chinese guest house, which, similar to the inn in Europe, was a family-based small-scale business and didn't establish itself as an individual building type in the modern sense. One reason why the hotel retained the image of foreign was its untenable nature to most Chinese. A local writer from Shanghai, Wang Dingjiu, wrote in 1932, "These places have no deep relationship to us Chinese, and besides, the upper-class atmosphere in these Western hotels is very solemn. Every move and gesture seems completely regulated. So if you don't know Western etiquette, even if you have enough money to make a fool of yourself, it's not worthwhile." That is to say, from the Chinese viewpoint, the real significance of the hotel is not its function to accommodate travelers, but a form of behavior and manner, which is far removed from the Chinese custom. After the revolution in 1949, the foreignness of the hotel was no longer just associated with different behavior but was a legal fact. From the 1950s to 1980s, accommodation for travelers was divided into two types according to nationality of the guests, Chinese citizens and the foreigners. The former type was called the hostel, 招待所, and the later the hotel, 宾馆. Except for those who were privileged, Chinese citizens were not allowed to stay in hotels and vice versa. This regulation set the hotel outside Chinese life for some 30 years, until 1985, when a five-star hotel in Guangzhou, the White Swan Hotel, first opened to public. Since it opened to public, it becomes the public space of the city and one of the most popular sightseeing places for tourists, and also a place for local peoples to celebrate Chinese New Year. Apart from the regulation, hotels were built to a much higher standard than the ordinary life of the Chinese. Let's look at the comparison. From this diagram, we can see that the average accommodation area of the hotel was more than 3 times that of the hostel and 4 times the living area, not to mention equipment and other facilities. From 1950s to 1980s, in general, there was no individual toilet, bath, and kitchen in a normal household. A reasonable design and reasonable use was once a way to resolve the problem of housing shortage at the time, and to keep the potential to accommodate the improvement of living standard in the future. When the hotel became more accessible to the public from the late 1980s, the new image of the hotel was less concerned with the identity of foreigners, the nature of travel or standardization of space and the services, but more with the material provisions, convenience, physical equipment, and the facilities, which hotels possessed and which the daily life of the Chinese lacked. At this point, it is not surprise for us to learn that in the mid-1990s, "Give you a 5-star home" was a powerful marketing slogan in the housing market. In brief, the category of the new acted as an opposite to the things familiar to the Chinese and existing in China. Now let's look at how the new was used to account for the imported architecture schools in the 20th century. Indeed, the new was a broad umbrella which covered a range of imports. Compared with the architectural history in Western Europe and the USA, the history of modern Chinese architecture could be characterized by the absence of a coherent modernism. As a hotel, the new architecture, generally understood as Western style, started with importation in the late 19th century. Whether new classical, Art Deco, or English revival, they were above all recognized by the formal differences from traditional Chinese buildings. In effect, when modernism was introduced in the late 1920s, it was regarded as a new fashion, succeeding new classicism. Wu Jiang, an architecture historian from Shanghai, made it clearly. To the Shanghai natives, the Western revivalist architecture never represented a kind of conservative idea. On the contrary, it represented a new thing. Its old style was newly imported. Because of this, when Western modernist architecture entered into Shanghai, it didn't contrast with the revivalist architecture, but only added one more modern style. This image shows the time when some landmark buildings were built up on Shanghai sponge. We can see that from New Classicism to Art Deco, it only took some 10 years. But in Europe, this process took more than 100 years. In addition, The building types to which modernist style were applied in the 1930s were mostly committed to commercial use, such as hotels, luxury apartment houses, department stores, cinemas, and only later on hospitals and private houses. In contrast to modernism in Europe, which was concerned with social engineering and was supported by industrial production, modernism in China was intertwined with consumption from the very beginning and didn't address the issue of normal people's lives. In parallel with the introduction of modernism, a form of new and Chinese architecture, the Chinese inherent style was promoted. The historical complication involved in this issue goes beyond the discussion of this paper. The point is that instead of objecting to modernism, the Chinese inherent architecture was proposed in order to oppose the Western style as a whole and to transform traditional Chinese architecture into modern on the basis of the Beaux-Arts system. Thus, during the first half of the 20th century, the opposition between modernism and eclecticism existing in Europe was blurred in Chinese architecture, as they both were ascribed to the category of the new in the first place. The potential for Chinese architecture to move in a modernist direction was cut down in the 1950s. Given the interference of state ideology, socialist content national form became the orthodox approach for constructing new Chinese architecture. Modernism was no longer associated with the new. It was condemned as a representation of capitalism and was criticized for lacking artistic content and national character. The socialist content national form formula was first introduced from the Soviet Union, where the Soviet experts and the buildings they designed in China around the 1953. Soon after, it dominated the design of landmark buildings and academic discussion. As a realism in art, socialist content national forms stressed the formal representation of social political meanings. One example then was that the horizontal strip window was regarded as the representation of capitalism, and the horizontal and the vertical was that of the socialism. From the pictures we can see, in general, the openings are all vertical instead of horizontal. In the meantime, buildings with a modernist appearance, mainly housing factories and stadiums, spread over the country in terms of technological advance and economic constraint. Insofar as modernism was repressed, all buildings produced at the time, whether revivalist, eclectic, or modernist style, counted as new. However, this kind of practice was not new, but continued the Beaux-Arts tradition in the name of the new and served the new political ideology. When China reopened to the world at the end of the 1970s, modernism and postmodernism entered into China at the same time. The temporal compact didn't give enough time for Chinese architecture to digest and rethink modernism, and led to the prevalence of the newer trend, postmodernism. Apart from the pursuit of the new, the introduction of postmodernism, which attacked modernism's uniformity and simplicity, met a sympathy in Chinese reaction to the political repression in the Cultural Revolution, and provide a new theoretical basis to support the general issue of cultural expression raised in the mid-1980s. Postmodernism in China could be said to have taken up Charles Jenks's version and interpretation. In the 10 years from 1982 to 1992, two of his books, What is the Language of Postmodern Architecture and What is Postmodernism, and some other 5 articles were published in nationwide journals. By contrast, Rapid Venturi's complexity and contradiction in architecture was only partially translated in 1981 and published as an outprint in 1991. Two factors led to the emergence of this situation. First, the language of postmodern architecture was more contemporary. The third edition was published in 1981 and met the Chinese eagerness to know what was happening in the West. Second, Jenks's metaphors and the semantics, although they contained brand new terms to the Chinese, corresponded to the previous symbolism designated by politics. At a practical level, words and syntax as modes of design were not difficult to operate for Chinese architects who were familiar with the composition skill inherent in the Beaux-Arts training. In 1989, a Chinese architecture journal, The World Architecture, had an election for the most notable world buildings of the 1980s, selected by Chinese architects. This is the first 9 buildings in the list. This list may not have represented everyone's viewpoint, but projected a general perspective on contemporary architecture, the prevalence of postmodernism, the popularity of figurative architecture, and the tendency to combine local context with modern structure. In the 1990s, along with the emergence of deconstructive architecture, some Chinese architects start to question the inadequacy of postmodernism, which directly link sign and symbol to cultural meanings. This realization didn't lead to a rethinking of modernism, the relationship between modernism and postmodernism, and the relationship between modernism and the current Western architecture, but rather urged the pursuit of even newer one. The comprehension of modernist architecture, as characterized by formal simplicity, functional determination, and technological advance, remained at least till the end of the 20th century. In 2000, Wang Lu, the chief editor of the World Architecture and an architectural professor in Tsinghua University, wrote a summary of architecture schools in the last decades of the 20th century for Chinese architecture students. In regard to the shift from modernism to postmodernism, he wrote, at the end of the 19th century, modern architecture began to eliminate decoration in traditional historicist architecture. Chapter, pediment, pitched roof were replaced for simple cube, flat roof. Reinforced concrete and glass wall were largely employed. However, although the expressive curves of corp and the rigid grid and the details of myths showed varieties of modern architecture, a new architectural trend had already started. In 1960s, it reclaimed interest in the style of historical architecture and the concern for decoration. It didn't want any longer to follow Bauhaus's functionalism that was regarded cold and boring. This trend was later called the school of postmodernist architecture. In one summary, the new doesn't seem to be articulated as a strong concept, but rather a loose term, which is used to describe one thing coming after another. Nonetheless, insofar as his summary is based on a formal account of the relationship with the history, modernism and postmodernism are remained as a stylistic succession. That is to say, throughout the 20th century, the imported architecture schools such as neoclassicism, modernism, and postmodernism were not perceived and conceived as individual categories opposing one to another, but rather as different styles within a single category of the new. This situation reveals that while importation from Europe and the USA sustained the emergence of modern Chinese architecture and its development, it didn't arrive as symmetrical reflection of what it was in the original context. Come back to our argument. In the process of importation, there were a number of terms translated from English to Chinese, such as modernity, modernism, postmodernism, etc. Our discussion shows that the literal meanings of the term, which the linguistic translation concerns, are far from adequate to address how the terms were used, what they referred to, and hence how imported knowledge were understood in the Chinese context, historically and culturally. Against that, we propose the conceptual translation, which concerns the category that the concept operates and the references to which it refers, as a way to discern the formation of architectural discourse in different contexts. Thank you.
Is there a stick, a mouse? It doesn't, no, it doesn't run. What do I do? Show? It doesn't, maybe it's my fingers. Before going to the questions, and I have prepared single questions for the papers, but I think it would be better to open up. What I have done was really to try and understand, well, first the title of the day, and the role of this session within the day, and which problems it might bring forward. So the idea, of course, is that of addressing the new in architecture, but not so much the emergence of the new, but rather an understanding of it, or several possible understandings of it. So the emphasis, I think, is, of course, on critique, on the discourses of and on the new, rather than on the new itself. While the day has a title, the sessions don't, and this is not, I think, just an obsession of mine. So what I've tried to do is to provide a title, but it's a visual title with something which is definitely not new, but exactly half a millennium old. And this is Giorgione's Three Philosophers, probably mistitled. So there are discourses in the painting, but also in what we address today, which take different forms, objects and techniques. And the sessions, although they have no titles, do revolve around some main key concerns. And so here is a visual title, which I would like to cut through in a very unorthodox way by literally slicing it. It portrays different forms of knowledge in different ages of man in relation with the past, the present, and the future. Now, critiquing the new seems to inevitably engage with the past, or some form of past, its definition and categorization, first of all. a distance needs to be established in different ways. By departing from the fabric of established normality, while at the same time engaging with it, as in Tanya's paper. By dismantling received structures of authorship in order to design the collective, as Pedro has proposed. By incorporating time in the space of geographical and cultural distance in which the new is conflated with the foreign, as in Hua's paper. Now, the later sessions today, and particularly the second session of the morning, will deal with knowledge, the architectural past, the established discipline, and its representations. And then, in the afternoon, we'll see presentations of new forms of making, the architectural now, the redefinition of the discipline and its questions. But this first session today is important, and it has a difficult task, which is that of framing the discourse on the new in a textual way. It has proposed words, definitions, and readings as tools to address the new. Non-measurable, or rather non-quantifiable, the words which have been proposed in the session address and define an elastic frame for an interpretation. They introduce and they open up questions. They expose the space of the difference that allows us to re-elaborate on the new. They propose the new as a difference to be read, geographical, cultural, semantic, and temporal. So before the old man in Giorgione's painting delivers us the knowledge and the representation of the world, and the young architect, or plural architects, design it, the crimson-clad philosopher weighs. He prepares the words with which and upon which a discourse on the new can be constructed. He, or it, the discourse, needs to come first, like the purple dyeing of the thread, the pretextere, and I'm borrowing the word from Pedro, before the weaving of the purple toga pretexta. So these pretexts, the clue as semantic device to assess and arrest the new, in Tanya's paper, the acronym as designed neologism for the fabrication of non-existent plurals, in Pedro's paper, and the translation as importation of a new that is in fact translocated and compacted past, in Hua's paper, provide some of the non-quantitative tools to open a space for the critique of the new, as the space of the difference, and as such of plurality and possibilities for operations. Quite some acrobatics to put these three papers together, but I'll be happy to have the questions coming from you rather than from me, but I don't know, let's see how it goes. Or, what I would like to try and do is to engage you in conversation, because I think there are a series of recurring words and ideas which cut across the papers. Is there? Well, I'll start. To go in sequence, and maybe to try and provoke a discussion between Tanya and Pedro. The clue works with the new as a moment of discontinuity, but the analysis of the detective novels shows it working necessarily in context, not as a frozen context, but something which is constantly reactivated and active on the process. In other words, it is a way of pushing and keeping things in relation, where the relation is the critical thought. It is a sign to be read, it is concrete, it is arbitrary, and I think that's the key word. It's arbitrary and therefore subject to many interpretations. Now, if we move to the idea of the acronym instead, there is the necessity almost to propose it as a collection of individuals or initials or names, which requires a classification of some sort, but not necessarily an understanding. In other words, it classifies, but at the same time it does not reveal. It conceals elements. It is, I would call it, opaque. It doesn't explain how it works. And the two, the clue and the acronym, if we so conceive it, seem to work in completely different ways. Almost on one hand, engaging with what the problem is and labeling while packing it away in some ways. Would you argue?
Well, yeah, I think that to me the interesting part with acronym is that it at the same time tries to conceal and protect something or some sort of architect's name or collective thing. On the other hand, it also is a sign for that collectivity, and in some sense, because if it's just the accumulation of initials, it sort of works as a universal language, which means that in a sense acronym is somehow against the critical regionalism, let's say. You cannot know where the practice is in China or in Europe or wherever. You know. And in that sense, it's opposite how you are proposing to Tanya's clue, which I guess relates more to the problem of context, in a sense. Acronyms tries to, in a sense, and the problem of being a universal language is also part of this strategy of contracting a name to its minimal units of signification in order to use it as if we're sort of, I don't know, as if we're money, so you can sort of use and circulate around, and without boundaries and without having to be concerned necessarily with the problem of context or with the problem of really having to explain what the acronym is supposed to mean. I'm not sure.
No, what I think is that, to a certain extent, the use of the acronym is also part of a context. I mean, to the wider context within architecture, and as an impulse, you know, it's almost like the crime, right? I mean, like someone is. I mean, you establish it very well. I mean, we have to respond to the modernism. You know, like how do we respond, or to this figure of the architect, the romantic architect, as the sole figure. And a way of, I think that would establish the fabric of normality at certain moment. And then the response to that, which is, it would be the crime, I think, in my reading, is the use of the acronym and proposing, you know, like the acronym and proposing a collectivity as opposed, you know, like to the figure, to one person. And that, but then the important thing is to notice that as you put, you know, like all these acronyms that you use, you know, they reveal another, they are codified and they constitute a new normality. I think now the question would be, I mean, now it's very usual to have these acronyms and it's no longer. In terms of the practice itself, yeah, these acronyms conceal a lot of the things that are within, and I think it's interesting.
I think it's a matter of words, the word that we like to use, because on the one hand, I'm saying that acronyms can help is to my text a pretext to talk about something else, which is, let's say, collaboration and the collective. But of course, we can try to say that acronym is a clue in the sense that I use it as a clue to unravel, let's say, or to go backward,
Yeah.
as to start talking about Gropius and Gideon, that in fact, perhaps, apart from the Siam, let's say, didn't work out the notion of acronym as such, in a sense. So acronym is being used as a clue, let's say, has to
the
go back
practice,
and to articulate a problem that, in my opinion, might or might not really be exactly the argument that I'm proposing, but where the notion of collaboration and the way in which collaboration relates to certain technologies, like the technology of assemblage, let's say, is being worked out as a rhetorical argument to propose forward, let's say, the elimination of the individual in order to grasp a collective, let's say. So I think.
Yeah, I think it's a sign to something else. I mean, it's signaling what the practice is doing, the acronym, most of the time. And so I do think it works pretty much like a clue, the acronym.
But isn't it in some way preempting it? You propose something which is constructed as a clue, and say the acronym is the clue. It's almost like the note in the sink saying this is not a clue. If you say this is a clue, are you inviting investigation or not? Because on one hand, there's not really anonymity in the acronym. It's almost an invitation to find out what happens behind it. So, or by labeling it and putting it in front of an audience or a market, everything which lies behind is intentionally concealed.
I think that together with using the term clue, you can use the term evidence in a sense, because it's like the question I tried to propose in the initial page of my paper, which is, if acronym is the case, so this is the case, is already here and is there, the question is, what else must be true for this to be here, let's say, so for this to be the case? And therefore you start having to answer that question, and in that sense you start having to construct back all the different inputs that might help to understand why something like this actually emerged in a certain moment, in a certain specific moment in time, and not before or not after, let's say. And in that sense, acronym perhaps can be considered a clue, but is also fundamentally an important evidence of something that's been going around for, in my opinion, 18 years at least, and which relates to the idea that, in a sense, a certain sign is supposed to contract a name, but that also relates to the problem of having to get rid from this Renaissance genius, from this romantic genius, and trying to start organizing a new subjectivity. I think perhaps sometimes architecture is so complicated in trying to find new forms, so there is a problem in trying to find new forms that sometimes finding new names is a much easier way. And acronym is a way of doing that. When you look at something like the new, I think it was published by ACTAR, a new dictionary of contemporary architecture, where basically what they are saying is that, well, if we have an architecture, we need a new dictionary, dictionary, let's say. But most of the terms are not new, are old terms that have been around, and what you're doing is putting a different name, right? For instance, what I'm trying to propose is that collective design is not the same like teamwork, but somehow there is something there. The mechanics of collaboration is not the same as collective design, but of course there is a connection. And collective intelligence in design is different from Gideon's proposition in only one term. And more or less the notion of the collective is still there. So what is being updated is not the concept, is the word, right? And in that sense, it's very interesting to look at a book by Adrian Forty, who is saying words and buildings, and he's trying to look at all the different meanings of long-standing terms. So this is the opposite exercise. It's saying which are all the different terms that come to name all standing meanings, right? So one part of that is the notion of collective design. Another one can be the notion of diagram, if you want, that of course has, I think it's been Tony Bidler proposing that it's not that different from party, which is coming from the 19th century, and so on and so forth, you know. And I really think that important part of the updating of architecture is a matter of language, it's a matter of giving new names to old concepts, without forgetting that, of course, things change. I mean, collective design in Gideon is not exactly the same as collective intelligence in design nowadays, right?
But in that sense, it's the impulse of keep reading things differently and mark differences in the reading of terms and notions that are pre-established in a way, or they constitute themselves in a way.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
One interesting way we can push the whole discussion of the acronym, I think, is also whether the acronym stands for a certain manifesto, say FOA, FAT, UFO, you know, where the words composing the acronym actually stand for something which is meant to, you know, indicate a certain mode of operation, say like OMA in Rafael Moneos's view, versus those acronyms, which is just like the name, the surname of the first name of the team, say like MVRDV or SANA, or etc. etc.
Yeah, I think that when I said that it seems that acronym waits for classification, is that because what I did here is putting all of them together in the same plane, you know, category. But of course, acronyms are different. I mean, there are acronyms that are sort of summarizing the names of the partners of the company. That is one layer of it. There are acronyms that summarize a sort of commercial branding. So you have the partner of the company, the commercial branding, and acronym. So acronyms come to be a sort of third layer of naming. So that's why I'm interested in acronym, because you tend to think that it's a shortening of the name, but it's not. It's expanding the name. It's like putting 3 layers to the name. So you no longer have one name, you have 3 names that can operate in different ways within architectural discourse or discipline. And that is very interesting, I guess, about the notion of acronym as well.
Mark.
It seems to me one way of putting what you've said is to say that your analysis of the acronym actually forces you to reanalyze the ordinary name. I mean, in that sense, Foster is an acronym, in the sense that, you know, it's a collection of letters which are registered in law and which state a kind of principle of ownership. Now, that can be given either by a traditional name, Foster's, and in a sense he knows that perfectly well, because you actually kind of pay a different fee as to whether you want your building to be known as by Foster Associates. You have to pay more if you want your building to be known Norman Foster Building. And that's, as it were, stated and enforceable ad law. So clearly the question of law comes into it. So while it may start through some sort of admirable wish to give some kind of expression to a collectivity, the paradox is it's used, or it functions, to assert the singularity of ownership.
I think we probably may agree that the acronym by itself is in fact an arbitrary convention. Emphasis on arbitrary, because we know how the acronyms are made. But that opens actually a rather sort of more interesting situation, because you know, it opens directly a paradox. And the paradox I would illustrate by a concrete example. If you take Rem or Zaha, why is it they bother about OMA? They've got enough, you know, their position established and so on. In other words, you know, if you look closely, you discover that a number of people use acronyms. You know, they apparently, on the surface, as you yourself been arguing, on the surface, apparently, they suppress the individuality and open the door to some kind of a notion of team and collectivity, etc., etc. But in fact, very often and more often than not, the opposite is the case. It enhances the position of the individual. And that seemed to me, far more provocative and interesting, and I'm sure that particularly when it comes to so-called creative territories, we talk about film, literature, television, media, and architecture, including this first would be the case, that it is rather enhancement of the individual rather than looking to some kind of an imaginary non-existent team. If it's there, it's a wallpaper. And the individual will use it always that sort of way. He would create the anonymity in a second stage of the drama.
Well, that's why also it's interesting the paradox that we can think that someone like Le Corbusier was an individual artist, but the office was always full of people working there. And there is all this struggle between him and Xenakis and Julian and all the people that work there about authorship and all these issues. So it seems to be an isolated individual having a name, but in fact, of course, there was collective work in there. But sometimes nowadays you can have an acronym, a very complex one, and there is only one architect behind that because it operates more as a branding, trying to recap some sort of contemporary discussion and not necessarily going back to that. So you have this sort of transformation between the individual that in fact worked in a collective way and the one that used acronym as a collective thing, but in fact it's an office composed by one or two people in a sense.
I would have a very small comment just at the end. It seems to me very important to separate the site of the acronym and its creation and use, which is totally instrumental, conventional, banal, and comes and goes. People change it as it goes because it's more convenient to switch it to something else. Maybe the 3/4 of the whole business of acronym is that, and maybe 1/4 is the one that interests you. But unless you separate it, you are in a mess all the time because you elevating to artificial intellectual level of complexity and sophistication something which is totally cynical, instrumental, every day. It's like a pair of shoes that you're using. You can turn it into a philosophical argument, of course, but there are more interesting topics for thinking, genuine thinking. So that seems to me like a bit of a problem here. Not to get too much involved in things which are just useful, banal, every day. You don't think about it.
Yeah, but that's why I guess I try to be quite clear at the beginning of my paper in saying that you're never sure if it is worth the effort to write a paper about it. And secondly, that acronym is only a pretext to start wondering about issues that I really think are important. And that is the whole point of my paper, I guess.
Can we go back to the new for a moment? I'd like to ask Juan to come into the discussion because I think there is another element which is not only the eruption of the new as in Tanya's contribution on the clue as the occasion or the fleeting moment or a process which happens within a system like that of collaborative practices and the acronym, but the new you have presented is almost a collision of different systems. It's not only the Western architecture which comes into China, but it brings a series of what you call the etiquette, a series of behaviors, etc. And it seems that the only way to almost deactivate it or absorb it is to neutralize it by mixing all the labels so that it's reduced to a style which is other and then becomes Western modern, and only through that process can be somewhat assimilated or at least dealt with and contrasted. And I think it's quite interesting because it's the idea of the system which is preempted from its potential otherness or challenge, also of course in political terms. Would you see it as a different way of dealing with it.
Different way of dealing?
Yeah. When the new comes as a system, which is a new which is already old, in other words, and it's already defined, but it's renewed because it's important. It's the idea of the translation. It seems from the presentation and from the examples you showed that the only way to absorb it by contrast is to do this de-labeling or relabeling, where the differences are somehow ignored or spread across different styles. And this process of renaming, Western, modern, which doesn't exist, allows to, in a way, take it in.
Yes or no? And what I think is it's not relabeling this. What I'm thinking is more about the conceptual categories, and which used is from when one culture, like the discourse, is translated into another, it face two situations, and the original one and the ending, the translated one. But what I mean is actually I'm kind of I oppose this kind of labeling, and because you label it as an otherness, so you don't really see how the things are there. And these are part of that, but my objective of this paper is to see how this concept is translated and in different contexts, and how the terms cut through these different fields it indicates.
Yeah, Brian.
So to take this back to acronyms, when the communists came to power, did they attempt anything remotely resembling, or were any of them amongst them who attempted anything like the utopian project of a new language that you get in Soviet Union after 1917? Because as far as I know, the first people who really mobilized acronyms were the Soviets. And you get all these things like Narkomfin, and various ministries and agencies are given these strange names, which are a kind of bureaucratic equivalent to some of the fantasies about a kind of proletarian language or a universal language that were around. But it occurs to me that in China, it might revolve around the nature of a character. And I wondered if there's anything remotely resembling that happened under the Chinese communist regime.
Resembling what?
The attempt to somehow institute a sort of a new imprimatur upon official language that would somehow be a combination of a bureaucratic technique and a complete rethinking of the previous way of writing characters and speaking and naming things.
You mean in the Chinese context,
Yeah.
the bureaucratic system with the renaming things
Yeah.
in terms of the Chinese tradition?
Yeah.
Yes, I think it has a connection, but what I'm concerned is not this kind of this kind of tradition, because the way in which the Soviet Union's system was introduced in China is on the basis of the new, it's like a modern construction and organization. It is, of course, that some previous traditional ways of doing things, like naming things, is probably transformed into this system. But it's a completely different organization. The basis, the foundation of organization is different, because it was tradition, but now it's modern way. That's what I think.
Do you have more questions?